Alright everybody, what's up? Today we're going to be taking a look at the latest Black Sabbath album, 13. It took me a little bit to get this one. I've been kind of busy. I was hoping to get it to be a bit more timely, but whatever. So I really tried to listen to this album with an open mind and really kind of view it on its own, because when you're talking about, this is the first album with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Ozzy Osbourne since the 1978 Black Sabbath album Never Say Die. So there's a lot of baggage that comes with something that's been gestating for this long. Do you compare it to Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy? Do you compare it to Heaven and Hell? Do you compare it to the latest Ozzy solo records? Do you compare it to The Devil You Know? So really, I kind of tried when I listened to this to get rid of all those kind of preconceptions and kind of look at it for what it is, and also set aside some of that drama with Bill Ward being out of the picture, which I'm going to tackle towards the end of this review. If you want to stick around, I'm going to try to crack in to the meat and bones of this and then do some of the rambling on the back half. So, getting right into this, Rick Rubin produced this one. They attempted around 2001 to do an album with Rick Rubin, and it sort of fell through. So, they kind of started from scratch with Rick Rubin here, who brought them the first Black Sabbath album and kind of said, to use that as a launching point, which I don't really feel a lot that they did that on this record. Now, the first track, End of the Beginning, there is some of that callback to the title track of Black Sabbath, Black Sabbath, in the quieter kind of parts and the slow, build. This is a really doomy number and a really great number. It's long, but it never felt overly long to me. There's some cool solos, the tempos change. I thought this is a great way to start the album off. I really like this track. Ozzy's voice actually sounds pretty good. It sounds a little rough, but I like that because I think that Ozzy's voice has been overproduced, especially in the past couple Ozzy solo records. So for them to go with a bit more of a natural approach on this one is really good, and it helps call back to some of those earlier Sabbath albums. It's just a great track, a great way to start the album, and it really eased some of my doubts going into this record. So going next to God Is Dead, this was the first single that they released. Now, this song isn't bad, but it is overly long, and it's actually pretty formulaic. One of the new songs, they recorded 2 new studio tracks on the reunion album in '98. One of those was Psycho Man. I know a lot of people say that song was bad, and there is a lot. This song is cut from the template of Psycho Man. It starts with a really heavy, slow riff, and then it's kind of quiet, and then there's a slow, heavy part, and that builds and builds and builds until it stops and segues into the last quick, fast part. It's not a bad track. It really grew on me, but there's not a lot to it. There's only one really small solo right at the tail end of a song that's almost 9 minutes long. So, this track is just, it's good, but it's overly long. Which, moving forward then, Loner then, which was good, that they this is a quicker song, it's a shorter song at 5 minutes. I like this one. This one's kind of classic Sabbath. I think this one would fit in on Sabotage pretty well. It's just a good track. And then, I'm going to do track by track here, so, bear with me. Zeitgeist is next, which reminds me kind of Planet Caravan, which is, I'm glad, again, I was afraid, one of the problems with The Devil You Know was a lot of really tedious, monotonous, slow songs, which, Tony Iommi's guitar tone is great at that, but it's nice to see some variety on this one, especially with Zeitgeist, this really nice Planet Caravan type feel. It gives you a good break, then I'm going to whip through a couple of these kind of quicker. Age of Reason, it's a good track, but, again, it suffers from being, slightly too long, but it's pretty good. And then Live Forever, I think, is nice. Geezer Butler, did most of the lyrics on this record like they did in the old days. Ozzy would, suggest certain titles and certain themes. But one thing I think that's nice about Live Forever, when you're singing about I don't want to live forever, but I don't want to die, it adds a lot of weight when you're talking about, a group of guys in their mid to late 60s. It's just, these are guys who, they've lived hard, a hard lifestyle. So there's definitely some weight behind this song from some older people, especially, with Dio's passing and Tony Iommi's cancer. It adds nice authenticity to these kind of lyrics. There's a lot of themes on this record about, dying and death, and, that's one of the successes of this record, I think, is that the authenticity of that, from some older dudes, they add a different vibe than some of these younger guys singing about it, when you have some older dudes. So that's a good track. And then now Damaged Soul, I went back to earlier when Rick Rubin said to look at the first album and take some of that blues influence that they had. There's not a lot of that on this record, but this track, it really shines through. And I really like it. Ozzy plays the harmonica on it a little bit, like he did on The Wizard on the first record, and it's just a really bluesy, kind of fuzzed out, song, which gives it a bit of a different sound and vibe from some of the other doomier numbers on the track. So again, it's a nice one for variety's sake, and it really gives those blues influences, which is good. And then we close things out on Dear Father, which is about priest and molestation and things like that. It's another doomy, number. It suffers from being a little overly long, but it's a good track. There's some really cool solos on here. And then the nice thing is it ends with, the sound of thunder and rain and the tolling of bells, which actually ends on the way that the original record begins. So if this does wind up being the final Black Sabbath album, they kind of bring it, full circle back to where they started, which is a nice touch. So that closes up, the core standard edition of the album. Now I purchased the Best Buy exclusive version, which gives you 3 bonus tracks, then a 4th exclusive track to the Best Buy version. They're Methodemic, Peace of Mind, Pariah, and then the Best Buy track, Naivety in Black. And Naivety in Black is actually really good. I actually would be upset if I didn't have it. It's short, at 3 minutes and 50 seconds. It's fast. It's something that it could have been nice on the core album, somewhere in there to break up some of the longer tracks and give you a bit of a breather. And then the other one's Methodemic, Peace of Mind, Pariah, all doomier numbers. They're pretty good. Pariah stands out as having a pretty cool riff that Ozzy sings over. But yeah, they're good. I'd recommend springing for it. But so closing it up, I was pretty impressed, with this album. I thought, Ozzy, Geezer, and Tony did really well. They brought in Brad Wilk from Rage Against the Machine and Audioslave as their session drummer, and he certainly did a serviceable job. In the closing here, I'm going to talk about the drums, but he did a decent enough job on that. If I had to complain about the mixing of this record, I will say I feel that the bass is too loud. Geezer's a great bass player. He has a great vibe, but I just feel it's almost prohibitively loud at some points. It's the loudest thing on the record is the bass, and I think that could have been turned down a notch or two. I definitely like to be able to hear Geezer's bass and have it be punchy, but I think it was just too loud. And the drums are a little weak in the mix. But again, as I said before, I really like what they did with Ozzy's voice. It kind of kept it more stripped back and natural. So to close out this record, it was stronger than I anticipated. Really good record, and better than Never Say Die for the most of the original lineup to go out on, if that winds up to be what they go out on. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. I'm going to take some points for being overly long, take some points off for being over familiar at a couple of points, but it's a solid record. So now to touch in real quick, ramble a bit about the drummer situation. Originally, when they announced this reunion, Bill Ward was going to be a part of it, the original drummer. And then there was some fallout. Bill Ward said that they didn't want to give him a decent contract, and they wound up replacing him. Tommy Cluftos did the drums for their touring, and then Brad Wilk did the drums on the record. And then after that record came out, Ozzy started making claims that Bill Ward was too out of shape, which there is some credibility in there. Drumming is obviously the most demanding aspect of a band, especially a metal band, and Bill Ward has never been in greatest shape, and he's getting older. But there's weird things when you read between the lines. Like Bill Ward was originally involved in the Dio reunion, and he claims that he left because Tony Iommi wanted him, the 3 new tracks they did for the Dio years, that he didn't want Bill Ward to drum in his signature style. He wanted to play more straight. And then they wound up getting Vinny Appice, who did drum them very straight. And then that held true on The Devil You Know. And then after Dio passed, Vinny Appice came out and said that he wanted to Sabbath up the drums on The Devil You Know, but Tony and Geezer wanted it to be drummed fairly straight, which is again what you got from Brad Wilk's drum on this record. So I think some of that might have to do with, they clearly have a desire, for some kind of just basic bare drums that hold the beat down, and if that's what they want, that's what they want. But I think some of that might have had something to do with it. So it's disappointing that they couldn't at least get Bill Ward on the record, for me, because I would have loved to see that complete original lineup. I thought, I saw Black Sabbath '99. Bill did a good job. I thought, you could tell they were starting to get a little tired when I saw him in 2005 or 6, somewhere around there. So maybe he wouldn't have been necessarily up, to the touring or playing full show. But, it would have been great to have him on the record and to have him add his, his signature sound. There's a lot of, the early Sabbath, everybody just had their thing. Ozzy had his unique voice. Geezer was a guitar player, so when he played bass, he had a really unique approach to playing the bass. He'd often play bass solos under Tony Iommi's guitar solos, which, again, Tony Iommi's guitar tone was great, and his approach was, really unique because of his accent with his fingertips. So you had these 4 great elements, I think, that meshed really well. Everybody brought something to the table, and it would have been nice to see the Bill Ward signature on this record. That would have, I think, knocked it up a couple notches for me. I might have given it, an 8 and 8.5 if Bill's element, that's sort of like Dave Lombardo and Slayer to me. It's just, that feels like Slayer to me with Dave Lombardo, and just like Sabbath, feels more like Sabbath when you have Bill Ward on the kit. But, that is what it is. So, alright, well, that wraps up, some of my thoughts on Black Sabbath 13, so, again, if you want to comment about it and tell me what you felt about it, feel free to do so below. Any suggestions about things for me to review in the future, I'd be happy to field them too. So, thanks for checking out another review. See you guys later.